Good day, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our presentation on the Decentralized Clinical Trials Draft Guidance as part of FDA's efforts to be responsive to the rapidly evolving clinical trial landscape and clarify the agency's recommendations on the conduct of decentralized clinical trials. The FDA will provide an overview of the draft guidance in today's webinar. It's our pleasure to welcome our presenters. First, we welcome Dr. Leonard Sachs, Associate Director of Clinical Methodologies in the Office of Medical Policy, CDER, and Dr. Ryan Robinson, Medical Officer, Clinical Methodology in the Office of Medical Policy in CDER. Please join me to welcome Dr. Sachs.
Welcome to this webinar on FDA's new draft guidance entitled Decentralized Clinical Trials for Drugs, Biological Products and Devices. I'm Leonard Sachs from the Office of Medical Policy in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA, and together with my colleague Ryan Robinson, we plan to give you an overview of the guidance, following which we will take questions from the audience. In this guidance, we define a decentralized trial as a clinical trial where some or all of the trial-related activities occur at locations other than traditional clinical trial sites. Why is FDA interested in decentralized trials? Everyone appreciates the challenges that individuals face when participating in traditional clinical trials. Getting to clinical trial sites for study visits can be disruptive and time-consuming. For patients with certain rare diseases, for example, travel to trial sites may involve flights, hotels, and days off work. By moving some or all trial-related activities to locations that are close to patients' homes, we hope to improve accessibility and convenience, to make it easier for patients with mobility or cognitive challenges to participate, and to improve the diversity of trial participants. Decentralized trials may improve efficiency by reducing the need for travel, reducing the demands on physical facilities to conduct the trial, and they may also take advantage of qualified clinical services in the community near to where patients live. Decentralized trial activities are not new. We have noted over the years, and particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, that many trial-related activities can be done by patients in their homes. In outpatient trials, patients take their investigational products at home, they may record their responses in patient diaries, and they may call study staff from their homes if they believe they are experiencing an adverse event. Telephone follow-up visits have been used for many years for trials that require long-term follow-up. And our 2016 guidance on the use of electronic informed consent allows patients to read and sign consent forms at home. Decentralized clinical trials involve a number of strategies to bring the trial to the patient. They may include the use of video and telemedicine visits, the use of digital health technologies, things like activity trackers, continuous glucose monitors, or wearable cardiac monitors. They may involve the direct distribution of investigational products to patients' homes. They may involve the use of electronic informed consent, home visits by study nurses, and the use of local health care providers and facilities. The goal of this guidance is to facilitate the use of decentralized trial procedures in a responsible way that ensures patient safety and well-being, as well as the reliability and the quality of trial-related data that are obtained. So I'm going to turn over to my colleague Ryan now to summarize the contents of the guidance, following which we will take your questions.
Thank you, Leonard. My name is Ryan Robinson, and I'm a physician in CDER's Office of Medical Policy. I will now provide an overview of the draft guidance, and following the conclusion of my portion of the presentation, we will transition to a question and answer session. So one of the first things to consider when conducting a DCT is the design of the DCT itself. As Leonard mentioned, we define DCTs in this guidance as clinical trials where some or all of the trial-related activities occur at locations other than traditional clinical trial sites. With this, we see trial activities potentially occurring at locations such as a participant's personal physician's office or their own home. Therefore, when designing the DCT and determining the assessments to be performed, consideration should be given to whether an assessment is expected to produce similar results regardless of whether it is conducted remotely or at a trial site. For example, if a participant is performing home spirometry, the result of this assessment may be different than if this was performed under the direct supervision of an investigator at a trial site. Further, assessments performed by local healthcare providers as part of routine clinical practice, for example, evaluation of a participant's symptoms, may be more variable and less precise than assessments conducted by trial personnel. This factor should also be considered when designing a DCT. Another consideration for studies design as it relates to DCTs is the statistical analysis to be performed. For example, in non-inferiority trials, if the effect size of an active control drug has only been determined in a traditional site-based clinical trial, it may not be reasonable to assume that the same effect size would be seen for the active control drug in a DCT. This may also present challenges in calculating a non-inferiority margin, and sponsors are encouraged to consult FDA review divisions when planning a non-inferiority trial in a DCT setting. In addition, as mentioned, the variability and precision of the data obtained in a DCT may differ from the data in a traditional site-based clinical trial. This would not affect the validity of a finding of superiority, but it could affect the validity of a finding of non-inferiority. In terms of inspections related to the clinical trial, while many locations used in a DCT may be remote, there should be a physical location where all clinical trial-related records for participants under the investigator's care are accessible and where trial personnel can be interviewed. This location will need to be included on Form 1572 for drug trials and in the IDE application for device trials. As was previously mentioned, remote visits and trial-related activities are important strategies to bring the trial to the patient, and the use of such strategies may make trials more convenient and more accessible to trial participants. By allowing participants to have visits at locations such as a local provider's office or even potentially in their own home, barriers to participation in clinical trials can be reduced. For example, certain participants may not live in close proximity to a trial site or may have difficulty traveling to trial sites in general. But through the use of local facilities and or home visits, they may be able to participate in a trial they otherwise may not have been able to. One type of a remote visit would be a telehealth visit, which could be conducted by an investigator or possibly other trial personnel. Telehealth visits with trial participants can be considered by investigators instead of in-person visits if no in-person interaction is needed. When including telehealth visits in a trial, the protocol should specify when a telehealth visit with a trial participant is appropriate and when a participant should be seen in person. Remote in-person visits and trial-related activities can be conducted by trial personnel who can travel to a participant's home or preferred locations. For example, a participant may prefer to be seen at their work using a mobile research unit instead of at their home. Depending on the protocol, remote in-person visits and trial-related activities may also be conducted by local healthcare providers who are located close to the trial participants' homes, but who are not part of the trial personnel. These visits might occur at participants' homes or at a local healthcare facility. So as was just alluded to, local healthcare providers such as doctors or nurses may be used by sponsors or investigators to perform certain trial-related activities. This may be done, for example, on a fee-for-service basis. Again, such local healthcare providers would not be considered trial personnel. Please note, though, there are certain stipulations regarding the trial-related services local healthcare providers should provide. These services should not differ from those that they are qualified to perform in clinical practice and also should not require detailed knowledge of the protocol or the investigational product. These services might include, for example, obtaining vital signs or performing a physical examination on a trial participant. If there are activities required by the study protocol that are unique to the research or do require detailed knowledge of the protocol or investigational product, these activities should be performed by qualified trial personnel who have been appropriately trained. The idea of allowing local healthcare providers to perform certain trial-related activities that fulfill the criteria just mentioned is that the local healthcare providers would simply be performing tasks no different than what they may perform in the course of their usual practice and which do not require specialized training to perform. Such local healthcare providers are already licensed and regulated in terms of providing such services, and their expertise could be relied upon to support a clinical trial. Regarding adverse event identification and management, the protocol should specify how adverse events identified remotely will be evaluated and managed, including how care will be provided for adverse events that require urgent or in-person attention. While we note that these items should be addressed in the protocol, we also acknowledge that many components of clinical trials are already decentralized and participants are sent home from traditional trial sites and must be able to report and respond to adverse events in this scenario as well. So in this way, the necessary measures to have in place and described in the protocol may not differ significantly from what would be required in a traditional trial. One additional note that should be made regarding the conduct of telehealth visits in conjunction with decentralized clinical trials is that such remote visits should comply with laws governing telehealth in the relevant U.S. states or territories and other countries as applicable. These laws are designed to ensure patient safety when participants are being seen remotely. Incorporation of the use of digital health technologies into clinical trials can help support decentralization. These DHTs could be smartwatches to track activity or sleep, they could be cellular phones to complete electronic patient-reported outcomes, or possibly continuous glucose monitors to evaluate a participant's glycemic control. As it relates to DHTs, it's important that sponsors ensure that DHTs are available to all potential trial participants. When a trial permits participants to use their own DHTs, sponsor-provided DHTs should also be available as an option to ensure that participants who do not have a protocol-specified DHT, for example, those who may not be able to afford the DHT, are not excluded from the trial for that reason. Sponsors should also ensure that the DHTs are suitable for use by all participants. This means that the usability of the DHTs has been evaluated as applicable for use in the study population. Please note that the FDA has published a draft guidance on digital health technologies for remote data acquisition and clinical investigations in December of 2021. This draft guidance provides recommendations to sponsors, clinical investigators, and other parties for measuring clinical events and characteristics of interest using DHTs to acquire data remotely from participants in clinical trials for drugs, biological products, and devices. The guidance provides recommendations on topics such as selection of DHTs for clinical trials, verification, validation, and usability testing, use of DHTs to collect data for clinical trial endpoints, training on the use of DHTs, and management of risks related to the use of DHTs in clinical trials. Now we will discuss the role and responsibilities of the sponsor. It is important to point out that a sponsor's responsibilities when conducting a decentralized clinical trial do not differ from their responsibilities when conducting a traditional site-based trial. In both instances, the sponsor will need to comply with the Investigational New Drug Application Regulations and/or the Investigational Device Exemption Regulations as found in Parts 312 and 812 of Title 21 and the Code of Federal Regulations, respectively. Sponsors should strive to achieve diverse and inclusive participant populations in their trials to achieve generalizability of study results to the population afflicted with the disease or condition being treated as applicable. These goals may be in part achieved by bringing trial-related activities to participants' homes, including through the use of DHTs, which may reduce the need for travel and improve engagement, recruitment, and retention amongst potential participants with challenges accessing traditional clinical trial sites. Also, outreach through local healthcare institutions, for example, local pharmacies or clinics, may facilitate recruitment of diverse participants in areas where there are limited traditional clinical trial sites. Further, the use of local healthcare providers may reduce cultural and/or linguistic barriers to participation in clinical trials. One important aspect of the sponsor's responsibilities that may be more so impacted by the decentralized nature of a trial is accounting for multiple sources of data in the data management plan. The sponsor will need to describe the data origin and flow of all data to the sponsor and the final storage of the data. They will also need to describe the methods used for remote data acquisition from trial participants, trial personnel, and contracted service providers. For example, was the data acquired through local clinical laboratory facilities or local healthcare providers who perform trial-related activities? The sponsor should also maintain a list identifying vendors for data collection, handling, and management. Another important aspect of the sponsor's responsibilities that may be more so impacted by the decentralized nature of a trial is the description of implementation of operational aspects of the trial and the study protocol. The description should include scheduled and unscheduled clinical trial visits, including those that are to be remote or in person as applicable, how transmission of reports on activities performed at different locations will occur, for example, transmission of reports from medical imaging, clinical laboratory tests, and/or procedures performed at the trial participant's home, work, or other local facility. The description should also include how investigational product will be delivered to trial participants if applicable, how the investigational product will be accounted for, and how safety, monitoring, and management of adverse events will occur. Sponsors must ensure proper monitoring of the investigation, which is also described in Parts 312 and 812 of Title 21 in the CFR. As with any trial, sponsors may use a variety of approaches to monitor decentralized clinical trials, and the monitoring plan should be based on the sponsor's risk assessment. Items sponsors should describe in the monitoring plan include how monitoring will be implemented to assess protocol compliance and data quality and integrity, the frequency with which trial records and source documents will be reviewed, and any unique aspects related to the decentralized trial procedures. Again, as with any trial, FDA encourages risk-based monitoring approaches and the use of centralized monitoring. Also, in general, please note sponsors must comply with all relevant local laws, regulations, and license requirements governing medical practice and IP administration when conducting a decentralized clinical trial. Now we will move on to discuss the role and responsibilities of investigators as it relates to decentralized clinical trials. Similarly to sponsors, the responsibilities of investigators conducting decentralized clinical trials do not differ from the responsibilities of conducting traditional site-based trials. Again, in both instances, the investigator will need to comply with the Investigational New Drug Application Regulations and/or the Investigational Device Exemption Regulations as found in Parts 312 and 812 of Title 21 in the CFR. In general, the investigator is responsible for the overall conduct of the DCT, including oversight of individuals delegated to perform trial-related activities. This includes ensuring that delegated activities are conducted according to the investigational plan, applicable regulations, and relevant laws. A key difference for DCTs is the extent to which the investigators use telehealth, trial personnel working remotely, local healthcare providers, and/or DHTs in the conduct of the trial. Based upon these differences and the decentralized features of the trial, additional training, coordination, and standard operating procedures may be necessary to ensure consistent implementation of such trials. In terms of delegation of trial-related activities, when permitted by the trial protocol, investigators can delegate trial-related activities to local healthcare providers in order to allow the conduct of activities that require in-person interactions with trial participants. These activities might include, for instance, performing a physical exam, drawing a blood sample, or taking a blood pressure. These activities may occur at a local healthcare facility or at the participant's location, for example, their home. One critical consideration regarding delegation of such trial-related activities to local healthcare providers is the potential for variability in the approach across different practices for certain activities. These might include, for example, what data are documented when collecting vital signs or how a physical examination is performed. In order to help reduce variability in such activities, quality control measures, including regular review by investigators of participant data entered by local healthcare providers, should be performed. This will help in the assessment of the consistency and completeness of the required procedures. The type and full scope of quality control measures should be tailored to the criticality of the data and the complexity of procedures performed by the local healthcare providers. In addition to delegation of in-person activities to local healthcare providers, investigators may also use technologies such as video conferencing to allow direct oversight of trial activities delegated to trial personnel. These might include activities such as fitting of a wearable sensor, photographing of a skin lesion, or possibly conduct of physical examinations. Investigators conducting drug trials as either traditional site-based trials or DCTs must complete Form 1572, the Statement of the Investigator. This form includes information such as the name and address of the investigator, the names and addresses of research facilities where the trial will be conducted, for example, medical schools or hospitals, the names and addresses of clinical laboratory facilities to be used in the study, and the names of any sub-investigators. In terms of determining when trial personnel should be included as sub-investigators on Form 1572, if they are contributing directly and significantly to the trial data, they should be included as sub-investigators on Form 1572. For further general recommendations on completing Form 1572, one can refer to the Information Sheet Guidance for Sponsors, Clinical Investigators, and IRBs, Frequently Asked Questions, Statement of the Investigator, Form FDA 1572, which was published in May of 2010. Local healthcare providers, as defined in this draft guidance, should not be listed on Form FDA 1572 as sub-investigators. Local healthcare providers should, however, be included in a task log, which we will discuss in more detail shortly. Similar to investigators in drug trials, investigators in device trials should also list local healthcare providers in a task log. Separately, sponsors of device trials must provide a full list of all investigators as part of their IDE application. As just mentioned, investigators, as part of preparing and maintaining adequate case histories, must maintain a task log of local healthcare providers who perform trial-related activities. The task log should include the names and affiliations of the local healthcare providers, a description of their roles and assigned tasks, the dates these local healthcare providers are added to the log, as well as the locations where these activities are conducted. I would note that healthcare providers that deliver care to trial participants but not as part of the trial, for example, emergency department physicians or a patient's own family physician, should not be listed on Form 1572, the list of investigators for a device trial, or the task log. The task log should be dated and signed by the investigator when it is initially created and updated when a new local healthcare provider is added to the log. The task log should be available to FDA during inspections. Some trial protocols will include designated clinical laboratory facilities to perform activities required by the protocol, for example, phlebotomy or x-rays. Other trial protocols may permit the use of a variety of clinical laboratory facilities close to the participant to perform these activities. Generally speaking, designated clinical laboratory facilities are preferable to minimize variability, particularly for critical data such as those used to evaluate outcomes and tests that are specialized. Local clinical laboratory facilities may be more appropriate for routine clinical tests that are well standardized and less prone to such variability. In certain situations, specimens from trial participants, for example, blood or sputum, may be collected by remote trial personnel, local healthcare providers, or directly by clinical laboratory facilities and sent to designated facilities for processing. All clinical laboratory facilities should be listed in the investigational plan for device studies under an IDE or included in Form 1572 if identified at the time the 1572 is signed. At least for drug trials, if additional facilities are added later, the list of such facilities can be maintained by the investigator and shared with the sponsor to submit to the IND. The regulatory requirements for obtaining informed consent in the IRB review process, including informed consent review, do not differ for decentralized clinical trials. While not a specific requirement to DCTs, the nature of DCTs may warrant special attention in informed consent regarding certain areas. For example, based upon the potential use of local healthcare providers, some areas of particular focus might include notifying participants whom to contact for answers to pertinent questions about the research and their rights as research subjects, as well as whom to contact in the event of a research-related injury. Similarly, based upon the use of local healthcare providers and local healthcare facilities, another area of focus might include describing to participants who will have access to their personal health information obtained during the decentralized clinical trial. To aid in conducting a trial remotely, investigators may obtain electronic informed consent from trial participants at their remote locations. If necessary, the process of obtaining electronic informed consent remotely may include a remote visit to help facilitate the process. In terms of IRBs, it is recommended to use a central IRB in decentralized clinical trials. The use of a central IRB should help facilitate efficient review of the protocol, the informed consent documents, and other relevant trial-related information. When considering whether a drug would be appropriate to evaluate in a decentralized clinical trial, it needs to be determined whether its administration outside of a clinical trial site is appropriate. When performing this assessment, the sponsor should take into account factors such as the complexity of administration, the safety profile of the drug, and the stage of drug development. Investigational drugs that involve complex administration procedures have a high-risk safety profile, especially in the immediate post-administration period, or are in early stages of development, such that the safety profile is not well defined, may need in-person supervision by the investigator at a trial site. For investigational drugs for which the safety profile is well characterized and which do not involve specialized monitoring during the immediate post-administration period, it may be appropriate for local healthcare providers or trial personnel working remotely to administer the IP at local healthcare facilities or participants' homes. Hybrid DCTs may be considered for drugs that require supervised but infrequent administration. In such cases, administration could be done at trial sites with follow-up done remotely. When considering whether a device would be appropriate to evaluate in a DCT, the sponsor should consider factors such as the type of medical device, its intended use, its instructions for use, and whether it is a significant risk or non-significant risk device. For example, medical devices suitable for home use, such as over-the-counter devices, that do not pose significant risk to trial participants may be appropriate for use by trial participants without an investigator's direct oversight. Use of medical devices that are not intended for self-use, for example, devices used in hospitals or ambulatory care settings, or that pose significant risk to trial participants, should be used or administered by qualified trial personnel with investigator oversight. In certain instances, it may be appropriate to have follow-up procedures which are required after using the medical device or after having the device surgically implanted be performed by local healthcare providers or trial personnel via telehealth visits at the home of trial participants or in local healthcare facilities. In order to support the decentralization of trials, DCT protocols may allow for the direct distribution of investigational products to trial participants at their locations. Related to this direct distribution, the protocol should describe several factors. One of the factors that the protocol should describe is how the physical integrity and stability of the IP will be maintained during shipment to trial participants. This description should include information such as the appropriate packaging material and the appropriate shipping methods for the product. For example, if the product needs temperature control, the product should describe the required temperature control specifications and how it will be maintained. Another factor that should be described is how investigators will track and document the trial participants or the participants' legally authorized representatives in certain cases receive investigational products. Additionally, the protocol should describe the procedures that investigators or participants should use to return or dispose of unused investigational products and how this return or disposal will be documented. In terms of shipping the investigational products to participants, shipping containers should include clear instructions for handling and storing the investigational products and instructions for returning unused investigational products. A central distribution service can be used to ship the IP to trial participants. It should be highlighted, though, that the investigator or delegated trial personnel must control the release of the IP by the distributor, monitor receipt and use by trial participants according to procedures described in the protocol, as well as monitor the return or disposal of any unused product as directed by the sponsor. In general, please note that sponsors and investigators must comply with applicable federal, state, and international laws and regulations that address shipping investigational products in their respective jurisdictions. Ensuring the safety and welfare of trial participants in a clinical trial is of paramount importance. To ensure the safety and welfare of trial participants in DCTs and all trials, the sponsor is required to properly monitor the investigations and make certain that the investigations are conducted in accordance with the general investigational plan and protocols contained in the IND or IDE applications. As part of this monitoring, the sponsor should implement a safety monitoring plan. Specific to DCTs, the safety monitoring plan should take the decentralized nature of the clinical trial into account and ensure that adverse events are appropriately captured and adequately addressed. This includes specifying if and when telehealth visits or in-person visits will be scheduled with trial personnel or local healthcare providers to collect safety data. While not unique to DCTs, the safety monitoring plan should also describe how participants are expected to respond to and report adverse events, including where to seek medical assistance locally when necessary and where to receive follow-up care. Continuing with adverse events, while again not unique to DCTs, trial participants must be able to contact trial personnel to report adverse events and have pertinent questions answered. This point is particularly important for participants in DCTs to understand based upon the potential use of local healthcare providers. Further, trial participants should be able to arrange for an unscheduled visit using telehealth or an in-person visit as appropriate. If significant safety risks emerge because of the remote administration or use of an IP, sponsors must discontinue remote administration or use. In addition, sponsors must also notify FDA, the IRB, and all investigators who have participated in the trial and determine if the trial should continue. We would note that if authorized in the protocol, routine safety monitoring involving laboratory testing and imaging may be performed using local clinical laboratory facilities close to trial participants. If such local laboratory facilities are used, investigators should ensure they promptly receive reports of these services and review them in a timely manner. Our last topic to discuss is the use of software in DCTs, which can be used to perform multiple functions to manage operations in the DCT. Such operations might include managing electronic informed consent, for example, maintaining approved versions of informed consent, documenting IRB approval, or archiving signed forms. Other operations could include the use of software to capture and store reports from remote trial personnel, local healthcare providers, and local clinical laboratory facilities, managing electronic case report forms, scheduling trial visits and other DCT-related activities, tracking investigational products that are shipped directly to trial participants, or syncing information recorded by DHTs. Regardless of the function of the software in conducting the DCT, training should be provided to all parties, including trial personnel, local healthcare providers, and participants using software to support the conduct of the DCT. We would note that software programs that are used to produce and process trial records required by the FD&C Act and FDA regulations are subject to 21 CFR Part 11. While real-time video interactions, including telehealth, are not considered electronic records and are not subject to 21 CFR Part 11, please note that local laws governing telehealth may apply. As was previously noted, this is a draft guidance, and we would appreciate your comments on the guidance. Please provide any comments to the docket by August 1st. We'll now transition to the question and answers portion of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you for the great presentations. We'll now transition to our Q&A session. If you haven't had a chance to enter your questions into the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. Looks like we have some questions coming in right now, and the first one's addressed to Dr. Robinson, and here is the question. How would one ensure adequate PI oversight over home health?
Thanks for the question, Ray. Good question. So assuming that the home health providers that are being referred to are what we would consider to be local healthcare providers, it would indeed be the investigator's responsibility to provide oversight of these individuals if they're being delegated to perform trial activities. That said, like we mentioned earlier, local healthcare providers should only be performing activities that would be part of their routine clinical practice. So, for example, maybe drawing blood or obtaining trial participants' vital signs. The activities, as we mentioned, also they'd be performing should also not be requiring a detailed knowledge of the protocol, the IP, or the investigator's brochure. Since these local healthcare providers are already licensed and regulated in terms of providing these services, hopefully their expertise could in general be relied upon to support clinical trial conduct. And based upon this, the amount of oversight needed may be limited in a way. Definitely each scenario would need to be evaluated independently in regards to what's required to provide adequate oversight. One point I would like to make regarding this topic is that the investigator will definitely need to review the reports from any such local healthcare providers on a regular basis to ensure the timeliness and the quality of the reports. So thanks for the question, Ray.
And thanks for responding to that, Dr. Robinson. We've got a few more questions that are rolling in right now, and here is the next question. What is considered the primary source data when home visits are performed?
Thank you for the question, Ray. Again, another good question. So typically in a decentralized trial, we would envision that the home visits would be completed either by trial personnel or they could be completed by local healthcare providers. In both cases, provided that the local healthcare providers have access to the ECRF, then the trial data could be entered directly into the ECRF in this situation. Also, the ECRF then would be then serve as the primary data source. Thanks for the question, Ray.
Thank you for responding to that question. The next question is the following. What will be the approach to inspections of decentralized trials?
Thanks for the question. As we were discussing during the presentation, for inspectional purposes, there needs to be a physical location where the clinical trial related records for participants under a given investigator's care can be accessed, and also a location where the trial personnel can be interviewed. I would note, though, that while a physical location should be identified for interviewing trial personnel, interviews of personnel could be conducted as needed by video or teleconferencing while an inspector is at the physical location. So, for example, when trial personnel are not in close proximity to the identified physical location, this could be difficult for them to travel to the site, obviously. And again, in these circumstances, video or teleconferencing could be appropriate. Thanks for the question, Ray.
And thank you for responding to that, Dr. Robinson. We've got a question about home health nurses, and here's the question. does the site PI have to list home health nurses on the delegation log specific to that site?
Thank you for the question. Very good question. So, a trial investigator, as part of fulfilling the regulatory requirements to prepare and maintain adequate case histories, must maintain this task log of local healthcare providers who are performing trial-related activities that are related to the participants under that investigator's oversight. As it relates specifically to home health nurses, if these individuals are delegated by the investigator to perform trial-related activities, which would otherwise be part of their routine clinical practice, and again, don't require detailed knowledge of the protocol or the investigational product or the investigator's brochure, then they would be considered to be local healthcare providers, and as such, they must be included on the task log. Thanks for the question, Ray.
Absolutely. We have a few more questions coming in about entering data in DCT, and here's the question. Who is allowed to enter data in a DCT? The patient, the site, or both?
Thank you for the question. So as with any clinical trial, DCTs, I guess are not special in some regards. So the investigator and other trial personnel who are delegated to do so can enter trial-related data into the case report forms. In addition, in DCTs, if the local healthcare providers do have access to the ECRF, then they can also enter trial-related data directly into the ECRF. As far as trial participants themselves, they wouldn't have access to the ECRF, and they would not be expected or actually even allowed to enter trial-related data. That said, data could potentially be provided directly from participants or subjects using electronic patient-reported outcome tools and DHTs as applicable to a given trial. Such data would electronically populate the ECRF, and in these cases, the data originator would either be the participant or, in the case of the DHT, the instrument used to capture the data. Thanks for the question, Ray.
Thanks for responding, Dr. Robinson. We've got a few more questions coming in talking about standardization, and here's the next question. How do you standardize an assessment with high variability like spirometry using DCTs?
Thank you for the question. This is a very good question as it relates to DCTs. So as we were discussing during the presentation, remote assessments and the data obtained from such remote assessments could indeed vary from those performed on site. And obviously, assessing for such variability and limiting it is quite important in a trial. Specifically for the example of using spirometry in a remote setting, limiting the variability would really depend on how the assessment is performed. For example, approaches could include monitoring of the assessments by trial personnel, either in the participant's home in person or possibly via telehealth, or the assessments could be supervised by local healthcare providers at a local healthcare facility. If, on the other hand, the spirometry was done digitally and therefore could be conducted by the participant alone, then really usability evaluation should be conducted to assess the ability of participants to use the DHT appropriately in the trial. These usability evaluations can really help ensure the measurements obtained in a remote setting are reliable, and ultimately they can also be helpful in informing participant training.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. We've got a few more questions here, and this is asking basically for a definition. And here's the question. What does qualified community providers mean? Is this referring to family doctors, for example?
Ryan, I'm back on the webinar, so maybe I can start answering. Can you hear me?
Okay, sure.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I guess the issue is that, we recognize that there are many qualified licensed practitioners outside of the clinical trial environment, that are capable of doing the functions and so on that they normally perform in clinical practice. And they could play a very important part in decentralized trial activities. So things like local physicians being asked to do vital signs or measure patients' weight, local phlebotomists drawing blood, local radiologists getting chest x-rays, provided these people are qualified in their own spheres by licensing and so on. These would be regarded as local healthcare providers in this sort of framework.
All right, we've got a few more questions coming in. Thank you, Dr. Sachs. And the next question, I'll send it out to the team and then we'll just come off mute, whoever wants to answer this one. Is the FDA equally supportive of all the strategies to bring the trial to the patient? And are there some strategies that would give FDA pause?
I'm happy to start answering that. I think the correct answer is that it depends on the trial design and what's required. Just to give an example, if the investigational product is a labile product that requires intricate sort of methods to reconstitute it, and it has to be given over a certain period of time with monitoring, obviously that wouldn't be an appropriate way to run the trial, to distribute directly to patients. So I think in each instance it would depend on the trial and the disease. If the trial was likely to have a high incidence of serious adverse events, or it was involving patients who were unstable or very sick, that also wouldn't be appropriate for televisits and so on. So I think it would really have to be tailored to the disease and the investigational product.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got another question just came in. It's directed to Dr. Robinson. And here's the question. Do local healthcare providers need to be added to the 1572 if they are providing trial-related activities?
Hi, Ray. Thanks for the question. So specifically in the guidance, we do call out that local healthcare providers, which we defined as providers who are performing trial-related services that are part of their routine clinical practice, and again, where they don't require detailed knowledge of the protocol, the IP, or the investigator's brochure, do not need to be listed on the form FDA 1572. So in general, local healthcare providers we do not anticipate them to be listed on form 1572.
All right, thank you for answering that question. And we do have a few more questions coming in, and we'll put out to the team. And here's the next question for the team. Do local healthcare provider physical locations need to be listed in the 1572 and the study task log? Also, the same question would be going for clinical laboratories under a local healthcare provider's supervision and oversight.
Perhaps I can start answering, and maybe Ryan, you can help me along there. But
Sure.
First of all, local healthcare providers are not required to be listed on the 1572, but in our guidance we do indicate that they should be on the task log, and the task log should list basically not. I don't think we're that concerned about the physical location, but the institutional affiliation and who they are. So I think basically so that we know where the data is coming from. If it's a radiology facility, that should be listed. If it's a radiologist, if the local healthcare provider is a traveling nurse, that should be listed, at least the affiliation of the nurse. So I think that's really how we would look at filling out the task log, but I'll turn to Ryan. Ryan, do you have any other thoughts?
No, not really. Just as you were saying, yeah, we don't expect the local healthcare providers to be listed on the 1572, but again, they do need to be in the study task log. And then similarly, we do expect all the clinical laboratory facilities, whether they be local or otherwise, to be listed on the form 1572. And then, as was mentioned during the presentation, some of these facilities are not going to be necessarily known for remote facilities in a DCT. So if those are determined after the 1572 is signed, then the investigator should track these and then report these to the sponsor, who can then submit them to the IND.
Thanks for responding to that question. We've got another question referencing slide 8. And here's the question. Does this slide mean that a local healthcare provider or nurse performing activities not different from their usual practice do not need to be included on the site delegation log, and the PI is not responsible to oversee them?
I'll just start with that. The answer is no. They are as local healthcare providers required to be listed on the task log, and I think we emphasize very clearly in the guidance that investigator oversight is required. Now, obviously, it depends what that means, and we've sort of to some extent, it means that the investigators should make sure that these are qualified personnel to whom the tasks are being delegated, and they should also periodically review reports that come in from local healthcare providers to make sure that they're timely, that the quality is good, and so on. So I think in the end, there is responsibility, some responsibility rests with the investigator to make sure that the material coming in from local healthcare providers is supervised and adequate. Ryan, any thoughts about that?
No, I totally agree with the response. Nothing more to add.
Thank you for responding to that question. And we do have another question regarding mobile clinics. And here's the question. Would FDA consider mobile clinics conducting clinical trials to be a local healthcare provider or a preferred location? And does the mobile clinic location need to be listed in both the 1572 and the study task log?
I'll do my best to answer that. This is mobile sort of clinical services, sometimes implemented by sponsors. I think we would regard them as sort of local services, and they would be listed as such. We would expect them to be listed on the task log because these are delegated functions that need to be supervised remotely. But on the other hand, I don't think we would expect you to list the location of a mobile clinic in a truck, for example. Again, I think we would expect the institutional affiliation. I'm not sure if that answers the question. Any other thoughts?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a new question just came in about protocol, and here's the question. Is it expected that the protocol should indicate which assessments are trial specific versus those that may be performed by a general healthcare provider?
Thanks, Ray. I'm not quite sure that I understand the question. I mean, all the activities required by the trial that will be performed by local healthcare providers should be listed in the protocol. There's no reason to do anything that's not listed in the protocol. So I think all activities done by local healthcare providers would be protocol stipulated.
Yeah,
I don't know
this
if
is
you have
Ryan.
any other thoughts about it.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think there's an expectation that the protocol specifically spells out which trial activities are trial specific and which could be performed by a general healthcare provider. Again, I think obviously all of the items in the trial I think would be looked at similarly.
Thank you for responding to the question. We've got a question regarding the 1572 and where things should be filled out. And here's the question. I think I heard you mention that an address for location of records, for example, should be placed on the 1572 for DCTs. Where on the 1572 would this apply? Box 1 is often the address of the investigator's office, but not necessarily where the records are kept or where study staff work. But if it is a DCT and no patient or study visits are taking place at this address, where would you suggest this address be placed on the 1572?
I can answer this one, Ray. So I think, as was noted, the 1572 in Section 1 is to list the name and address of the investigator, whereas Section 3 is the name and address of any medical school, hospital, or other research facility where the clinical investigations will be conducted. There is not actually a section or specific box where the physical location where records can be accessed or personnel can be interviewed on the 1572. Now, typically, it would either be most likely the address that's listed in sections 1 or 3. But again, there is not a specific section to list this physical location on the Form 1572.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a question in regards to healthcare provider training and clinical trial activities. And here is the question. Could healthcare providers that aren't trained to conduct trial-related activities, even if it's not in their initial area of expertise?
Maybe I can take a crack at that, and Ryan, you can chime in. But I think the whole idea is to make use of healthcare providers for the services that they normally routinely provide and not to give them special training. I think once special training is required and the activities required by the local healthcare provider become something that's protocol specific and presumably requires some understanding of the protocol and the investigational product, we would expect those people to be investigators or sub-investigators and not local healthcare providers or local healthcare providers used in that capacity. They would generally be listed on the 1572 as such. So I think if they're doing specialized things that require training for the trial, then they should be listed either as investigators or sub-investigators. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Ryan.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I totally agree. I think the idea of training healthcare professionals to do trial-specific tasks kind of goes against the idea or usefulness that we tend to perceive for the use of local healthcare providers, and in that they're performing tasks that they're regularly doing on a daily basis anyway. So again, there is not this additional training necessary.
Thank you for responding to that question. We got another question just came in about internet access, and here's the question. Does the guideline state that all eligible participants should have access to DHTs, include a provision for assistance with internet access?
I can try and respond to that. Sorry, maybe I'll just start off by saying that I guess the thrust of what the digital health technology guidance says is that it's important not to exclude patients based on not having the equipment. And, implicit internet access would be potentially a problem. So I think to some extent it would have to be, trial designers would have to look at the areas where trial participants are involved and make an assessment as to whether there's significant where the patients are significantly excluded because of internet accessibility. But I think that's there are other ways of getting around that, and I guess certainly cell phones are pretty ubiquitous. That may be a way of getting patients connected, but I'll defer to Ryan for your thoughts, Ryan.
I think the general thought there is obviously similarly to the DHTs themselves, that we would hope or possibly have the expectation that sponsors would be providing internet access as well to not exclude certain participants from a trial.
Well, thank you for answering that question. That is about all the time we have for questions during this webinar. A huge thank you to our presenters for the great presentations and answering numerous questions that came in today. We do have a few closing reminders for our audience. This activity is eligible for an attendance certificate which supports continuing education by ASOCA, RAPS, SQA, and ACRP. Please refer to our website at fda.gov/CEDAR-SBIA for more details. You'll be able to obtain the attendance certificate only upon completion of the survey, which will remain open for 2 weeks. And remember, that's July the 5th. Please remember to download the certificate immediately upon completing the survey. It cannot be retrieved after the fact. Let us know your comments and feedback via the survey. This will help guide the design of our future events. On behalf of CEDAR Small Business and Industry Assistance, we hope that you enjoyed today's presentation and found it helpful. We look forward to your presence at future webinars, which will be advertised on our website at fda.gov/CEDAR-SBIA. Thank you for attending, and this concludes today's webinar.